India to 1926. India to 1926. In the decade 1910 to 1920, the two greatest problems to be faced in creating a Commonwealth of Nations were India and Ireland. There can be no doubt that India provided a puzzle infinitely more complex, as it was more remote and less clearly envisioned than Ireland. When the British East India Company became the dominant power in India about the middle of the 18th century, the Mughal Empire was in the last stages of disintegration. Provincial rulers had only nominal titles, sufficient to bring them immense treasure in taxes and rents, but they generally lacked either the will or the strength to maintain order. The more vigorous tried to expand their domains at the expense of the more feeble, oppressing the peace-loving peasantry in the process, while all legal power was challenged by roaming upstart bands and plundering tribes. Of these willful tribes, the most important were the Marathas. These systematically devastated much of south-central India in the last half of the 18th century, forcing each village to buy temporary immunity from destruction, but steadily reducing the capacity of the countryside to meet their demands because of the trail of death and economic disorganization they left in their wake. By 1800, only one-fifth of the land in some areas was cultivated. Although the East India Company was a commercial firm, primarily interested in profit, and thus reluctant to assume a political role in this chaotic countryside, it had to intervene again and again to restore order, replacing one nominal ruler by another, and even taking over the government of those areas where it was more immediately concerned. In addition to the cupidity of many of its employees, led them to intervene as political powers in order to divert to their own pockets some of the fabulous wealth which they saw flowing by. For these two reasons, the areas under company rule, although not contiguous, expanded steadily, until by 1858 they covered three-fifths of the country. Outside the British areas were over 500 princely domains, some no larger than a single village, but others as extensive as some states of Europe. At this point, in 1957 to 1958, a sudden violent insurrection of native forces, known as the Great Mutiny, resulted in the end of the Mughal Empire and of the East India Company, the British government taking over their political activities. From this flowed a number of important consequences. Annexation of native principalities ceased, leaving 562 outside British India, but under British protection and subject to British intervention to ensure good government. Within British India itself, good government became increasingly dominant, and commercial profits decreasingly so for the whole period of 1858 to 1947. British political prestige rose to new heights from 1858 to 1890, and then began to dwindle, falling precipitously in 1919 to 1922. The task of good government in India was not an easy one. In this great subcontinent, with a population amounting to almost one-fifth of the human race, were to be found an almost unbelievable diversity of cultures, religions, languages, and attitudes. Even in 1950, modern locomotives linked together great cities with advanced industrial production by passing through jungles inhabited by tigers, elephants, and primitive pagan tribes. The population, which increased from 284 million in 1901 to 389 million in 1941 and reached 530 million in 1961, spoke more than a dozen major languages, divided into hundreds of dialects, and were members of dozens of antithetical religious beliefs. There were, in 1941, 255 million Hindus, 92 million Muslims, 6.3 million Christians, 5.7 million Sikhs, 1.5 million Jains, and almost 26 million pagan animists of various kinds. In addition, the Hindus and even some of the non-Hindus were divided into four major hereditary castes, subdivided into thousands of subcastes, plus a lowest group of outcasts, untouchables, amounting to at least 30 million persons in 1900 and twice this number in 1950. These thousands of groups were endogamous, practiced hereditary economic activities, frequently had distinctive marks of garb, and were usually forbidden to marry, eat or drink with, or even to associate with persons of different caste. Untouchables were generally forbidden to come in contact, even indirectly, with members of other groups, and were accordingly forbidden to enter many temples or public buildings, to draw water from the public wells, even to allow their shadows to fall on any person of a different group, and were subject to other restrictions, all designed to avoid a personal pollution which could be removed only by religious rituals of varying degrees of elaborateness. Most subcastes were occupational groups covering all kinds of activities, so that there were hereditary groups of carrion collectors, thieves, highway robbers or murderers, thugs, as well as farmers, fishermen, storekeepers, drug mixers, or copper smelters. For most peoples of India, caste was the most important fact of life, submerging their individuality into a group from which they could never escape, and regulating all their activities from birth to death. As a result, India, even as late as 1900, was a society in which status was dominant, each individual having a place in a group which in turn had a place in society. This place, known to all and accepted by all, operated by established procedures in its relationships with other groups, so that there was, in spite of diversity, a minimum of intergroup friction and a certain peaceful tolerance, so long as intergroup etiquette was known and accepted. The diversity of social groups and beliefs was naturally reflected in an extraordinarily wide range of social behavior, from the most degraded and bestial activities based on crude superstitions, to even more astounding levels of exalted spiritual self-sacrifice and cooperations. Although the British refrained from interfering with religious practices in the course of the 19th century, they abolished or greatly reduced the practice of thugism, in which a secret caste strangled strangers in honor of the goddess Kali; sati, in which the widow of a deceased Hindu was expected to destroy herself on his funeral pyre; infanticide, temple prostitution, and child marriages. At the other extreme, most Hindus abstained from all violence. Many had such a respect for life that they would eat no meat, not even eggs, while a few carried this belief so far that they would not molest a cobra about to strike, a mosquito about to sting, or even walk about at night lest they unknowingly step on an ant or worm. Hindus who considered cows so sacred that the worst crime would be to cause the death of one, even by accident, who allowed millions of these beasts to have free run of the country to the great detriment of cleanliness or standards of living, who would not wear shoes of leather, and would rather die than taste beef-ate pork, and associated daily with Muslims who ate beef but considered pigs to be polluting. In general, most Indians lived in abject poverty and want. Only about 1 in 100 could read in 1858, while considerably less could understand the English language. The overwhelming majority at that time were peasants, pressed down by onerous taxes and rents, isolated in small villages unconnected by roads, and decimated at irregular intervals by famine or disease. British rule in the period 1858 to 1947 tied India together by railroads, roads and telegraph lines. It brought the country into contact with the Western world, and especially with world markets, by establishing a uniform system of money, steamboat connections with Europe by the Suez Canal, cable connections throughout the world, and the use of English as the language of government and administration. Best of all, Britain established the rule of law, equality before the law, and a tradition of judicial fairness to replace the older practice of inequality and arbitrary violence. A certain degree of efficiency and a certain ambitious, if discontented, energy directed toward change replaced the older abject resignation to inevitable fate. The modern postal, telegraphic and railroad systems all began in 1854. The first grew to such dimensions that by the outbreak of war in 1939 it handled over 1 billion pieces of mail and 40 million rupees in money orders each year. The railroad grew from 200 miles in 1855 to 9,000 in 1880, to 25,000 in 1901, and to 43,000 in 1939. This, the third largest railroad system in the world, carried about 6 million passengers and 90 million tons of freight a year. About the same time, the dirt tracks of 1858 had been partly replaced by over 300,000 miles of highways, of which only about a quarter could be rated as first class. From 1925 onwards, these highways were used increasingly by passenger buses, crowded and ramshackle in many cases, but steadily breaking down the isolation of the villages. Improved communications and public order served to merge the isolated village markets, smoothing out the earlier alternations in scarcity and glut with their accompanying phenomena of waste and of starvation in the midst of plenty. All this led to a great extension of cultivation into more remote areas, and the growing of a greater variety of crops. Sparsely settled areas of forests and hills, especially in Assam and the northwest provinces, were occupied without a devastation of deforestation, as in China or in non-Indian Nepal, because of a highly developed forestry conservation service. Migration, permanent and seasonal, became regular features of Indian life, the earnings of the migrants being sent back to their families in the villages they had left. A magnificent system of canals, chiefly for irrigation, was constructed, populating desolate wastes, especially in the northwestern parts of the country, and encouraging whole tribes which had previously been pastoral freebooters to settle down as cultivators. By 1939, almost 60 million acres of land were irrigated. For this and other reasons, the sown area of India increased from 195 to 228 million acres in about 40 years, from 1900 to 1939. Increases in yields were much less satisfactory because of reluctance to change, lack of knowledge or capital, and organizational problems. The tax on land traditionally had been the major part of public revenue in India and remained near 50% as late as 1900. Under the Mughals, these land revenues had been collected by tax farmers. In many areas, notably Bengal, the British tended to regard these land revenues as rents rather than taxes, and thus regarded the revenue collectors as the owners of the land. Once this was established, these new landlords used their powers to raise rents, to evict cultivators who had been on the same land for years or even generations, and to create an unstable rural proletariat of tenants and laborers unable or unwilling to improve their methods. Numerous legislative enactments sought, without great success, to improve these conditions. Such efforts were counterbalanced by the growth of population, the great rise in the value of land, the inability of industry or commerce to drain surplus population from the land as fast as it increased, the tendency of the government to favor industry or commerce over agriculture by tariffs, taxation and public expenditures, the growing frequency of famines from droughts, of malaria from irrigation projects, and of plague from trade with the Far East, which wiped out in 1 year gains made in several years, the growing burden of peasant debt at onerous terms and at high interest rates, and the growing inability to supplement incomes from cultivation by incomes from household crafts because of the growing competition from cheap industrial goods. Although slavery was abolished in 1843, many of the poor were reduced to peonage by contracting debts at unfair terms and binding themselves and their heirs to work for their creditors until the debt was paid. Such a debt could never be paid, in many cases, because the rate at which it was reduced was left to the creditor and could rarely be questioned by the illiterate debtor. All of these misfortunes culminated in the period 1895 to 1901. There had been a long period of declining prices in 1873 to 1896, which increased the burden on debtors and stagnated economic activities. In 1897, the monsoon rains failed, with a loss of 18 million tons of food crops and of 1 million lives from famine. This disaster was replaced in 1899 to 1900. This disaster was repeated in 1899 to 1900. Bubonic plague was introduced to Bombay from China in 1895 and killed about 2 million persons in the next 6 years. From this low point of 1901, economic conditions improved fairly steadily, except for a brief period of 1919 to 1922, and the long burden of the World Depression in 1929 to 1934. A rise in prices in 1900 to 1914 benefited India more than others, as the prices of her exports rose more rapidly. The war of 1914 to 1918 gave India a great economic opportunity, especially by increasing the demand for her textiles. Tariffs were raised steadily after 1916, providing protection for industry, especially in metals, textiles, cement and paper. The customs became the largest single source of revenue, alleviating to some extent the pressure of taxation on cultivators. However, the agrarian problem remained acute, for most of the factors listed above remained in force. In 1931, it was estimated that in the United Provinces, 30% of the cultivators could not make a living from their holdings even in good years, while 52% could make a living in good years but not in bad ones. There was great economic advance in mining, industry, commerce, and finance in the period after 1900. Coal output went up from 6 to 25 million tons in 1900 to 1924, and petroleum output chiefly from Burma, went up from 37 to 294 million gallons. Production in the protected industries also improved in the same period, until by 1932 India could produce 3/4 of her cotton cloth, 3/4 of her steel, and most of her cement, matches, and sugar. In one product, jute, India became the chief source of the world's supply, and thus became the leading export after 1925. A notable feature of the growth of manufacturing in India after 1900 lies in the fact that Hindu capital largely replaced British capital, chiefly for political reasons. In spite of India's poverty, there was a considerable volume of saving, arising chiefly from the inequitable distribution of income to the landlord class and to the moneylenders, if these two groups can be separated in this way. Naturally, these groups preferred to invest their incomes back in the activities whence they had been derived, but after 1990, nationalist agitation, and especially Gandhi's influence, inclined many Hindus to make contributions to their country's strength by investing in industry. The growth of industry should not be exaggerated, and its influences were considerably less than one might believe at first glance. There was little growth of an urban proletariat, or of a permanent class of factory workers, although this did exist. Increases in output came largely from power production rather than from increases in the labor force. This labor force continued to be rural in its psychological and social orientation, being generally temporary migrants from the villages, living under urban industrial conditions only for a few years, with every intention of returning to the village eventually, and generally sending savings back to their families and visiting them for weeks or even months each year, generally at the harvest season. This class of industrial laborers did not adopt either an urban or a proletarian point of view, were almost wholly illiterate, formed labor organizations only reluctantly because of refusal to pay dues, and rarely acquired industrial skills. After 1915, labor unions did appear, but membership remained small, and they were organized and controlled by non-laboring persons, frequently middle-class intellectuals. Moreover, industry remained a widely scattered activity, found in a few cities but absent from the rest. Although India had 35 cities of over 100,000 population in 1921, most of these remained commercial and administrative centers and not manufacturing centers. That the chief emphasis remained on rural activities can be seen from the fact that these 35 centers of population had a total of 8.2 million inhabitants, compared to 310.7 million outside their limits in 1921. In fact, only 30 million persons lived in the 1,623 centers of over 5,000 persons each, while 289 million lived in centers smaller than 5,000 persons. One of the chief ways in which the impact of Western culture reached India was by education. The charge has frequently been made that the British neglected education in India, or that they were made an error in emphasizing education in English for the upper classes, rather than education in the vernacular languages for the masses of the people. History does not sustain the justice of these charges. In England itself, government assumed little responsibility for education until 1902, and in general had a more advanced policy in this field in India than in England until well into the present century. Until 1835, the English did try to encourage native traditions of education, but their vernacular schools failed from lack of patronage. The Indians themselves objected to being excluded, as they regarded it, from English education. Accordingly, Accordingly, from 1835, the British offered English language education on the higher levels in the hope that Western science, technology and political attitudes could be introduced without disrupting religious or social life, and that these innovations would infiltrate downward into the population. Because of the expense, government-sponsored education had to be restricted to the higher levels, although encouragement for vernacular schools on the lower levels began without much financial obligation in 1854. The infiltration downward theory was quite mistaken, because those who acquired knowledge of English used it as a passport to advancement in government service or professional life, and became renegades from rather than missionaries to the lower classes of Indian society. In a sense, the use of English on the university level of education did not lead to its spread in Indian society, but removed those who acquired it from that society, leaving them in a kind of battering ground which was neither Indian nor Western, but hovered uncomfortably between the two. The fact that knowledge of English and possession of a university degree could free one from the physical drudgery of Indian life by opening the door to public service or the professions created a veritable passion to obtain these keys, but only in a minority. The British had little choice but to use English as the language of government and higher education. In India, the languages used in these two fields had been foreign ones for centuries. The language of government and of the courts was Persian until 1837. Advanced and middle-level education had always been foreign, in Sanskrit for the Hindus and in Arabic for the Muslims. Sanskrit, a dead language, was that of Hindu religious literature, while Arabic was the language of the Quran, the only writing the ordinary Muslim would wish to read. In fact, the allegiance of the Muslims to the Quran and to Arabic was so intense that they refused to participate in the new English language educational system and in consequence had been excluded from government, the professions, and much of the economic life of the country by 1900. No vernacular language could have been used to teach the really valuable contributions of the West, such as science, technology, economics, agricultural science, or political science, because the necessary vocabulary was lacking in the vernaculars. When the University of the native state of Hyderabad tried to translate Western works into Urdu for teaching purposes after 1920, it was necessary to create about 400 new words. Moreover, the large number of vernacular languages would have made the choice of any one of them for the purpose of higher education invidious. And finally, the natives themselves had no desire to learn to read their vernacular languages, at least during the 19th century. They wanted to learn English, because it provided access to knowledge, to government positions, and to social advancement, as no vernacular could. But it must be remembered that it was the exceptional Indian, not the average one, who wanted to read at all. The average native was content to remain illiterate, at least until deep into the 20th century. Only then the desire to read spread under the stimulus of growing nationalism, political awareness, and growing concern with political and religious tensions. These fostered the desire to read in order to read newspapers, but this had adverse effects. Each political or religious group had its own press and presented its own biased version of world events, so that by 1940 these different groups had entirely different ideas of reality. Moreover, the new enthusiasm for the vernacular languages, the influence of extreme Hindu nationalists like B.G. Tilak (1859–1920), or anti-Westerns like M.K. Gandhi (1869–1948), led to a wholesale rejection of all that was best in British or in European culture. At the same time, those who sought power, advancement, or knowledge continued to learn English as the key to these ambitions. Unfortunately, these semi-westernized Indians neglected much of the practical side of the European way of life and tended to be intellectualist and doctrinaire and to despise practical learning and physical labor. They lived, as we have said, in a middle world which was neither Indian nor Western, spoiled for the Indian way of life, but often unable to find a position in Indian society which would allow them to live their own version of a Western way of life. At the university they studied literature, law, and political science, all subjects which emphasized verbal accomplishments. Since India did not provide sufficient jobs for such accomplishments, there was a great deal of quote, academic unemployment, with resulting discontent and growing radicalism. The career of Gandhi was a result of the efforts of one man to avoid this problem by fusing certain elements of Western teaching with a purified Hinduism to create a nationalist Indian way of life on a basically moral foundation. It is obvious that one of the chief effects of British educational policy has been to increase the social tensions within India and to give them a political orientation. This change is usually called the quote, rise of Indian nationalism, but it is considerably more complex than this simple name might imply. It began to rise about 1890, possibly under the influence of the misfortunes at the end of the century, grew steadily until it reached the crisis stage after 1917, and finally emerged in the long-drawn crisis of 1930 to 1947. India's outlook was fundamentally religious, just as the British outlook was fundamentally political. The average Indian derived from his religious outlook a profound conviction that the material world and physical comforts were irrelevant and unimportant in contrast with such spiritual matters as the proper preparation for the life to come after the body's death. From his English education, the average Indian student derived the conviction that liberty and self-government were the highest goods of life and must be sought by such resistance to authority as had been shown in the Magna Carta, the opposition to Charles I, the Glorious Revolution of 1689, the writings of John Locke and of John Stuart Mill, and the general resistance to public authority found in 19th century liberalism and laissez-faire. These two points of view tended to merge in the minds of Indian intellectuals into a point of view in which it seemed that English political ideals should be sought by Indian methods of religious fervor, self-sacrifice, and contempt for material welfare or physical comforts. As a result, political and social tensions were exacerbated between British and Indians, between westernizers and nationalists, between Hindus and Muslims, between Brahmins and lower castes, and between caste members and outcasts. In the early part of the 19th century there had been a revival of interest in Indian languages and literatures. This revival soon revealed that many Hindu ideas and practices had no real support in the earliest evidence. Since these later innovations included some of the most objectionable features of Hindu life, such as sati, child marriage, female inferiority, image worship, and extreme polytheism, a movement began that sought to free Hinduism from these extraneous elements and to restore it to its earlier purity by emphasizing ethics, monotheism, and an abstract idea of deity. This tendency was reinforced by the influence of Christianity and of Islam, so that the revived Hinduism was really a synthesis of these three religions. As a consequence of these influences, the old and basic Hindu idea of karma was played down. This idea maintained that each individual soul reappeared again and again, throughout eternity, in a different physical form and in different social status, each difference being a reward or punishment for the soul's conduct and its previous appearance. There was no real hope for escape from this cycle, except by a gradual improvement through a long series of successive appearances to the ultimate goal of complete obliteration of personality, nirvana, by ultimate emergence in the soul of the universe, Brahma. This released moksha from the endless cycle of existence could be achieved only by suppression of all desire, of all individuality, and of all will to live. The belief in karma was the key to Hindu ideology and to Hindu society, explaining not only the emphasis on fate and resignation to fate, the idea that man was a part of nature and brother to the beasts, the submergence of individuality and the lack of personal ambition, but also specific social institutions, such as caste or even sati. How could castes be ended if these are God-given graduations for the rewards or punishments earned in an earlier existence? How could sati be ended if a wife is a wife through all eternity, and must pass from one life to another when her husband does? The influence of Christianity and of Islam, of Western ideas and of British education in changing Hindu society was largely a consequence of their ability to reduce the average Hindu's faith in karma. One of the earliest figures in this growing synthesis of Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam was Ram Mohan Roy, 1772 to 1833, founder of the Brahma Samaj Society in 1828. Another was Keshab Chandra Sen, 1841 to 1884, who hoped to unite Asia and Europe into a common culture on the basis of a synthesis of the common elements of these three religions. There were many reformers of this type. Their most notable feature was that they were universalist rather than nationalist, and were westernizers in their basic inclinations. About 1870 a change began to appear, perhaps from the influence of Ramakrishna, 1834 to 1886, and his disciple Swami Vivekananda, 1862 to 1902, founder of Vedanta. This new tendency emphasized India's spiritual power as a higher value than the material power of the West. It advocated simplicity, asceticism, self-sacrific cooperation, and India's mission to spread these virtues to the world. One of the disciples of this movement was Gopal Krishna Gokhale, 1866 to 1915, founder of the Servants of India Society, 1905. This was a small band of devoted persons who took vows of poverty and obedience, to regard all Indians as brothers irrespective of caste or creed, and to engage in no personal quarrels. The members scattered among the most diverse groups of India to teach, to weld India into a single spiritual unit, and to seek social reform. In time, these movements became increasingly nationalistic and anti-Western, tending to defend orthodox Hinduism rather than to purify it, and to oppose Westerners rather than to copy them. This tendency culminated in Bal Gangadhar Tilak (1859 to 1920), a Marathi journalist of Pune who started his career in mathematics and law but slowly developed a passionate love for Hinduism, even in its most degrading details, and insisted that it must be defended against outsiders, even with violence. He was not opposed to reforms which appeared as spontaneous developments of Indian sentiment, but he was violently opposed to any attempt to legislate reform from above, or to bring in foreign influences from European or Christian sources. He first became a political figure in 1891 when he vigorously opposed a government bill which would have curtailed child marriage by fixing the age of consent for girls at 12 years. By 1897 he was using his paper to incite to murder and riots against government officials. A British official who foresaw this movement toward violent nationalism as early as 1878 sought to divert it into more legal and more constructive channels by establishing the Indian National Congress in 1885. The official in question, Allen Octavian Hume (1829 to 1912), had the secret support of the Viceroy, Lord Dufferin. They hoped to assemble each year an unofficial congress of Indian leaders to discuss Indian political matters in the hope that this experience would provide training in the working of representative institutions and parliamentary government. For 20 years the Congress agitated for extension of Indian participation in the administration and for the extension of representation and eventually of parliamentary government within the British system. It is notable that this movement renounced violent methods, did not seek separation from Britain, and aspired to form a government based on the British pattern. Support for the movement grew very slowly at first, even among Hindus, and there was open opposition led by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan among the Muslims. As the movement gathered momentum after 1890, many British officials began to oppose it. At the same time, under pressure from Tilak, the Congress itself advanced its demands and began to use economic pressure to obtain these. As a result, after 1900, fewer Muslims joined the Congress. There were 156 Muslims out of 702 delegates in 1890, but only 17 out of 756 in 1905. All these forces came to a head in 1904 to 1907, when the Congress, for the first time, demanded self-government within the Empire of India and approved the use of economic pressures boycott against Britain. The Japanese victory over Russia in 1905, which was regarded as an Asiatic triumph over Europe, the Russian Revolt of 1905, the growing power of Tilak over Gokhale in the Indian National Congress, and public agitation over Lord Curzon's efforts to push through an administrative division of the huge province of Bengal, population 78 million, brought matters to a head. There was open agitation by Hindu extremists to spill English blood to satisfy the goddess of destruction, Kali. In the Indian National Congress of 1907, the followers of Tilak stormed the platform and disrupted the meeting. Much impressed with the revolutionary violence in Russia against the Tsar and in Ireland against the English, this group advocated the use of terrorism rather than of petitions in India. The Viceroy, Lord Hardinge, was wounded by a bomb in 1912. For many years, racial intolerance against Indians by English residents in India had been growing. and was increasingly manifested in studied insults and even physical assaults. In 1906, a Muslim League was formed in opposition to the Hindu extremists and in support of the British position, but in 1913 it also demanded self-government. Tilak's group boycotted the Indian National Congress for 9 years, 1907 to 1916, and Tilak himself was imprisoned for sedition for 6 years, 1908 to 1914. The constitutional development of India did not stand still during this tumult. In 1861, appointed councils with advisory powers had been created, both at the centre to assist the Viceroy, and in the provinces. These had non-official as well as official members, and the provincial ones had certain legislative powers, but all these activities were under strict executive control and veto. In 1892 these powers were widened to allow the discussions of administrative questions, and various non-governmental groups called communities were allowed to suggest individuals for the unofficial seats in the councils. A third Act of 1909, passed by the Liberal government with John Lord Morley as Secretary of State and Lord Minto as Viceroy, enlarged the councils, making a non-official majority in the provincial councils, allowed the councils to vote in all issues, and gave the right to elect the non-official members to various communal groups, including Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs, on a fixed ratio. This last provision was a disaster. By establishing separate electoral lists for various religious groups, it encouraged religious extremism in all groups, made it likely that the more extremist candidates would be successful, and made religious differences the basic and irreconcilable fact of political life. By giving religious minorities more seats than their actual proportions of the electorate entitled them to a principle known as weightage, it made it politically advantageous to be a minority. By emphasizing minority rights, in which they did believe, over majority rule in which they did not believe, the British made religion a permanently disruptive force in political life and encouraged the resulting exacerbated extremism to work out its rivalries outside the constitutional framework and the scope of legal action in riots, rather than at the polls or in political assemblies. Moreover, as soon as the British had given the Muslims this special constitutional position in 1909, they lost the support of the Muslim community in 1911 to 1990. This loss of Muslim support was the result of several factors. Curzon's division of Bengal, which the Muslims had supported, since it gave them East Bengal as a separate area with a Muslim majority, was countermanded in 1911 without any notice to the Muslims. British foreign policy after 1911 was increasingly anti-Turkish, and thus opposed to the Caliph, the religious leader of the Muslims. As a result, the Muslim League called for self-government for India for the first time in 1913, and 4 years later formed an alliance with the Indian National Congress, which continued until 1924.